The house stood at the very end of Maple Street. It was the kind of house people noticed, but rarely talked about. Old wooden walls, a wide porch, tall trees around it, and a long gravel path that led to the front door. When the wind blew, the branches would move slowly above the roof, making soft sounds that echoed through the quiet yard. I had not been there for almost 15 years. But now I was standing in front of it again, holding a small set of keys in my hand. My grandfather's house. My name is Daniel, and the reason I came back to this place was simple. My grandfather had passed away 2 weeks earlier. The lawyer told me the house now belonged to me. To be honest, I was not sure how I felt about that. When I was younger, I used to spend my summers here. My parents lived in the city, but every year they would send me to stay with my grandfather during school vacations. Back then, the house felt bigger. The hallway felt longer. The rooms felt darker. And there was always one thing that made the house feel strange. A door at the end of the hallway. A door that was always locked. Even as a child, I noticed it. The hallway had 4 doors. The kitchen. The living room. My grandfather's bedroom. And then the last door. The locked one. Every time I passed it, I wondered what was inside. But whenever I asked my grandfather about it, he always gave the same answer. Some rooms are better left closed. At the time, I did not understand what he meant. But children are curious. And I remember one summer afternoon when I tried to open that door myself. I must have been about 10 years old. My grandfather had gone outside to fix something in the garden. I was alone in the house, walking down the hallway when I stopped in front of the door. The handle was old brass, cold to the touch. I turned it slowly. Locked. Of course it was locked. But that only made me more curious. So I looked around the house trying to find the key. I checked drawers, cabinets, even under the table in the living room. But the key was nowhere. When my grandfather came back inside, he saw me standing near the door. He did not look angry, but he looked serious. More serious than I had ever seen him before. "Daniel," he said quietly, "do not try to open that door." I remember asking him why. And he stood there for a long moment before answering. Because some memories need to stay where they are. At the time, those words did not mean much to me. But I never tried opening the door again. Not that summer. Not any summer after that. Eventually, I grew older. School became busy. Life moved on. And my visits to the old house became less frequent. Until one year they stopped completely. Years passed. I went to college. I found a job. I built a life far away from Maple Street. But now I was back. Standing on the porch with the house keys in my hand. The wind moved gently through the trees as I unlocked the front door. The door opened with a long creaking sound. The smell inside the house was exactly the same as I remembered. Old wood, dust, and something else. Something that reminded me of quiet evenings when my grandfather would sit in his chair reading a book while the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. I stepped inside. The floorboards made soft sounds under my feet as I walked through the living room. Nothing had changed. The same furniture. The same old clock on the wall. Even the same small lamp beside my grandfather's chair. It felt as if time had simply stopped inside the house. But then I noticed something else. The hallway. At the far end of the hallway. The door was still there. Closed. Exactly the way it had always been. For a moment I simply stood there looking at it. After all these years, it was still locked. Still silent. Still mysterious. I slowly walked down the hallway. Each step felt strangely heavy. When I finally reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle. Cold brass. Just like I remembered. I tried turning it. Locked. Of course. But something about it felt different now. When I was a child, the door had simply been a mystery. But now it felt like something else. A secret. I stepped back and looked at the door more carefully. The wood looked older than the rest of the hallway. There were small scratches near the handle. Almost like someone had tried to open it many times before. And then I noticed something strange. There was no keyhole. Just a small metal plate where a keyhole should have been. Which meant something important. This door could not be opened with a normal key. I felt a strange feeling in my chest. Why would my grandfather lock a room in a way that nobody could open it? I stood there for a long time thinking about it. Then I heard something. A soft sound. Very faint. Almost like a small movement. From the other side of the door. I froze. The house had been empty for 2 weeks. There should not have been any sound at all. I leaned closer. The hallway was completely silent. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then, another sound. Very soft. Almost like something sliding slowly across the floor. My heart started beating faster. I stepped back from the door, trying to listen carefully. The sound stopped. The hallway became quiet again. Maybe it was just the house settling. Old houses made strange noises all the time. At least that is what I told myself. Still, something about that moment felt strange. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my grandfather's old chair. The house was silent again. But I could not stop thinking about the locked room. After all these years, why was it still closed? And more importantly, what was inside? That night I slept in my old bedroom. Or at least I tried to. The room looked almost the same as it did when I was a child. The same wooden desk stood near the window. The same small bookshelf leaned slightly against the wall. Even the same faded curtains hung beside the bed. But something about the house felt different now. Maybe it was because my grandfather was no longer there. Or maybe it was because of the locked door at the end of the hallway. I turned off the light and lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Occasionally, a branch tapped softly against the window. For a long time, everything was quiet. Then sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The room was dark, and the only light came from the moon shining through the window. I listened carefully. The house was silent. But then I heard it again. A faint sound. Very soft. Almost like something moving across the floor. My heart began beating faster. Slowly, I sat up in bed. The sound seemed to come from the hallway. I stepped out of bed and walked quietly toward the door of my room. The floorboards creaked slightly under my feet. I opened the door just a little and looked into the hallway. The hallway was dark. But at the far end, I could still see the shape of the locked door. And for a moment, I thought I saw something strange. The door was moving. Not opening. Just slightly shaking. I stood there frozen. The sound stopped. The door became completely still again. After a few seconds, I walked slowly down the hallway. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle again. Cold brass. The door was completely still now. No sound. No movement. Just silence. I waited there for almost a minute. Nothing happened. Finally, I stepped back and returned to my room. Maybe it was just the old house making noises. That's what I kept telling myself. Still, sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning the sun filled the house with warm light. The strange feeling from the night before seemed less important in daylight. I walked into the kitchen and made some coffee. While drinking it, I began thinking about what I should do with the house. There were many things to clean and organize. My grandfather had lived here alone for many years, and it showed. Old boxes filled the closets. Stacks of books covered the shelves. And the attic was probably full of things I had not seen in decades. So I decided to start cleaning. It felt like the best way to spend the day. I began in the living room. Dust covered most of the furniture, so I opened the windows to let fresh air inside. Sunlight slowly filled the room as I wiped the shelves and moved old papers into boxes. While cleaning a drawer in the small table beside my grandfather's chair, I found something interesting. A photograph. It was old and slightly faded. In the picture stood a young woman. She looked to be around 20 years old. She had dark hair and kind eyes. And she was standing in front of the very same house. But something about the photograph was strange. The edges of the picture had been damaged. And someone had scratched across the woman's face with a pen. Not enough to completely erase it, but enough to make it clear someone had tried. I stared at the photograph for a long time. I had never seen this woman before, and I did not remember my grandfather ever mentioning her. I placed the photograph on the table and continued cleaning. But as the day went on, I began finding more strange things. Inside an old book in the living room, I discovered a small envelope. Inside the envelope was a letter. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age. The handwriting looked careful and neat. The letter began with just 2 words. Dear Thomas. Thomas was my grandfather's name. I sat down and began reading. The letter was written by someone named Emily. The words sounded emotional, almost desperate. She wrote about how much she missed him, about how she hoped he would forgive her, and about how she wanted to come home. But the letter ended suddenly in the middle of a sentence, almost as if the writer had stopped writing unexpectedly. I felt a strange chill run through my body. Why would my grandfather keep a letter like this hidden inside a book? And who was Emily? I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. But something told me that this was not the only strange thing hidden in the house. Later that afternoon, I moved into my grandfather's study. This room had always been my favorite as a child. Tall bookshelves covered the walls. A large wooden desk stood near the window, and behind the desk was a small cabinet with many drawers. I began opening the drawers one by one. Most of them contained normal things. Old documents, receipts, letters from friends. But then I opened one drawer near the bottom of the cabinet. Inside was a folded map. I opened it carefully on the desk. It showed the area around the town, but one location had been circled in red ink. A small wooded area near the river. Next to the circle were 3 words written in my grandfather's handwriting. Last place seen. I stared at the map. A strange feeling grew in my chest again. Last place seen. Who was he talking about? Emily? The woman from the letter? Suddenly, the mystery of the locked room felt even deeper. The scratched photograph. The hidden letter. The map with the red circle. It all felt connected somehow. And I had a feeling that whatever answers existed, they were probably inside the locked room at the end of the hallway. As the sun began to set, the house slowly became quiet again. The long shadows returned to the hallway. And once again, my eyes moved toward the closed door, waiting silently at the end of the corridor. That evening, I could not stop thinking about the things I had found inside the house. The photograph with the scratched face, the unfinished letter, and the map with the words written beside the red circle. Last place seen. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like my grandfather had been searching for someone. Someone named Emily. The same name written at the beginning of the letter. The sun had almost disappeared when I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The cool evening wind moved gently through the trees around the house. Across the street stood another small house where an old man used to live when I was a child. I remembered him clearly. Mr. Clark. He had been my grandfather's neighbor for many years. If anyone knew something about the past of this house, it would probably be him. So I walked across the quiet road and knocked on his door. After a few moments, the door slowly opened. Mr. Clark looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white, and his back was slightly bent. But his eyes were still sharp. "Daniel," he said with surprise. I smiled slightly. "Yes, it's me." He nodded slowly and opened the door wider. "I heard about your grandfather," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." We sat together in his small living room. For a while we talked about simple things. About the town. About how much time had passed. But eventually I asked the question that had been on my mind all day. "Mr. Clark," I said carefully, "do you remember someone named Emily?" The old man became very quiet. His eyes moved toward the window for a moment. Then he slowly looked back at me. "Why are you asking about her?" he said. I told him about the photograph, the letter, the map, and finally, the locked room. When I mentioned the door at the end of the hallway, Mr. Clark let out a long breath. "I wondered how long it would take before you asked about that," he said. My heart began beating faster. "You know what's inside?" I asked. Mr. Clark shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But I know why it was locked." The room became very quiet. "Emily," he said softly, "was your grandfather's younger sister." I felt a wave of surprise. "Sister?" I repeated. Mr. Clark nodded. "Yes, they were very close when they were young." He paused for a moment before continuing. But one day, she disappeared. I leaned forward slightly. What do you mean disappeared? Mr. Clark rubbed his hands slowly. This happened many years ago, he said. Long before you were born. He explained that Emily had lived in the house with my grandfather when they were both young. She had been cheerful and kind, and everyone in the town liked her. But one day she simply vanished. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. The police searched the woods near the river for days. They questioned everyone in town. But no one ever found her. No one ever discovered what happened. Your grandfather never stopped looking for her, Mr. Clark said quietly. He searched for years. I remembered the map on the desk. The red circle. Last place seen. Eventually the police stopped investigating. But my grandfather continued searching. For months. Then years. Until one day he stopped talking about it. Stopped asking questions. Stopped searching. But something changed after that. He locked the room Emily used to sleep in, Mr. Clark said. And he never opened it again. I sat silently, trying to understand everything I had just heard. Emily had lived in the house. The locked room. It had been hers. Why would he keep it locked? I asked quietly. Mr. Clark looked at me for a long moment before answering. I think, he said slowly, he hoped she might come back one day. The walk back to my grandfather's house felt different. The evening sky had turned dark blue. The house stood quietly at the end of the gravel path. For the first time, I no longer saw the locked room as a mystery. I saw it as something else. A memory. But the question still remained. Why had Emily disappeared? Why had the photograph been scratched? And why had my grandfather hidden the letter and the map? When I entered the house, the hallway felt longer than usual. The door stood at the far end. Silent. Waiting. I walked toward it slowly. When I reached the door, I stood there for several seconds. Then I made a decision. If the truth was inside that room, I needed to see it. I went into the garage and found an old toolbox. Inside was a heavy metal bar. When I returned to the hallway, the house was completely silent. My hands felt slightly nervous as I placed the bar against the door. The wood creaked slightly. I pushed harder. The lock resisted at first. Then suddenly, crack. The lock broke. The door slowly opened. A cloud of dust floated into the air. For the first time in decades, the room was open. The air inside smelled old and forgotten. Moonlight from the hallway slowly revealed the shapes of the room. A small bed stood against one wall. A wooden desk sat near the window. And shelves filled with books covered the far side of the room. Everything looked exactly as it must have been many years ago. As if time had stopped. I stepped inside slowly. Dust covered every surface. But nothing had been moved. On the desk stood a small stack of journals. I opened the first one carefully. The handwriting inside belonged to my grandfather. Page after page described his search for Emily. Places he had visited. People he had spoken to. Clues he had followed. The search had lasted for years. But every entry ended the same way. No sign of her. I continued reading. Eventually I reached the final journal. Inside was the last entry my grandfather had written. The words were slow and careful. Today I am closing this room. I promise myself that if Emily ever came home, this room would be waiting for her. I will keep it exactly the way she left it. So she knows she was never forgotten. I slowly closed the journal. For a long moment I sat quietly in the room. My grandfather had not locked the room to hide something. He had locked it to protect a memory. He had been waiting. Waiting for a sister who never came home. After a while I stood up and walked to the window. The glass was dusty. I wiped it gently with my hand. Moonlight filled the room. For the first time in many years, fresh air entered through the open window. The room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a memory finally allowed to breathe again. Before leaving, I placed the journal back on the desk. Then I looked around the room one last time. Someone finally came back, I said quietly. And with that, I turned off the hallway light and closed the door. But this time, I did not lock it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel to motivate me.